Imagine a man who ruled a quarter of the planet from an armchair in a dim, lamplit library. Now imagine that same man as a shivering, half-blind schoolboy, pinned down on a filthy dormitory floor while older boys grind his face into the boards, whispering that he is weak, that he will never matter. The boy is Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil. The world will one day know him as Lord Salisbury, three-time Prime Minister of Britain, the last great aristocratic statesman of an empire on the brink. But when his story begins, nothing about him looks like a savior of anything, and the clock is already ticking. Because the world he is born into in 1830 is dying. Industrial chimneys are blackening the sky. New cities are boiling over with workers who cannot vote. The old order of land, title, and birth is cracking. Somewhere out there, a thin-driven boy named William Gladstone is sharpening his mind and his faith, determined to tear down the comfortable certainties that Robert's family live on. Two boys, two faiths, two visions of Britain. In a few decades, they will clash over who owns the future. But first, Robert has to survive his own childhood. He arrives in the world on a raw February morning at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, a palace of red brick and stone, all long corridors, echoing galleries and portraits that stare down from the walls like judges. Robert is born into immense privilege. His father is James, 2nd Marquess of Salisbury. His mother, Frances, is an heiress and the quiet power in the household. From the outside, it looks like a fairy tale beginning. From the inside, it feels more like a courtroom. The boy is small, sensitive, often ill. His father is stern, distant, quick to anger and slow to praise. The family motto might as well be, endure, but do not complain. Robert learns early that to show pain is to invite contempt. He hides in the library, running his fingers along the spines of books taller than his own arm, staring at the great Elizabethan portraits of statesmen who pulled the strings of England centuries before. They seem impossibly confident. He feels impossibly small. Outside Hatfield's windows, the world is changing. Railways slice through peaceful fields. Crowds flock to factories instead of farms. In smoky northern towns, men are beginning to ask why they pay taxes and fight wars, but still have no say in how they are governed. The old aristocratic class, Robert's class, still owns the land and runs the country, but the ground under their polished boots is trembling. Robert doesn't understand all this yet. He only feels a vague, nagging fear that somehow he has been born too late into a world that no longer wants what he was raised to be. At Eton, that vague fear becomes a daily, physical reality. They send him there when he is not yet a teenager. Eton is supposed to forge leaders, future ministers, generals, bishops. For Robert, it becomes a long, slow hell. The older boys sense weakness like blood in the water. He is delicate, short-sighted, more at home with a book than a cricket bat. That is enough. They mock his awkwardness, his high, hesitant voice. They turn him into a fag, a servant, ordering him to run errands, polish boots, light fires. When he moves too slowly, and he often does because he is almost always ill, there are knees in his ribs, fists in his back, hands in his hair driving his face down onto cold stone. The schoolroom is no refuge. Masters preach discipline, Latin verbs, and the greatness of England. Few notice the boy who sits in the back, jaw clenched, knuckles white, pretending not to care. At night, in the dormitory, he lies awake listening to snores and whispers, the muffled thud of someone else being taught a lesson. He counts the cracks in the ceiling. He imagines walking through the quiet galleries at Hatfield House, the footsteps of his younger self echoing on the stone. He feels utterly alone. Years later, he will remember his school days as unrelieved misery. The memory hardens into something colder. A distrust of crowds, of fashionable opinion, of the idea that the many are automatically right. When you have lived under the rule of a brutal majority in a school dormitory, the words mass democracy do not sound like salvation. They sound like a threat. And outside the school walls, that threat is growing. If Eton is cruelty, Oxford is revelation. Robert enters Christ Church, one of Oxford's grandest colleges, still shy, still unsure of himself. The town is a swirl of stone towers, bells, and earnest arguments. Here, at least, the weapons are words. He discovers that his mind is not weak at all. It is formidable. He devours history and theology. Mathematics and philosophy fall into place beneath his fingers. Conversation becomes a battlefield where he, for once, can strike back. His essays earn him a first in mathematics. His tutors are impressed. Behind small spectacles, the boy's eyes are suddenly, sharply alive. Outside the quiet of libraries, another kind of argument is raging. The Oxford movement is tearing at the soul of the Anglican Church, drawing it closer to Catholic ritual and theology. Young men debate salvation over late-night candles. Reputations are made and broken in smoky common rooms. Robert watches, listens, and chooses his own kind of distance. Religion matters to him, but so does skepticism. He distrusts fanaticism, whether in chapel or in politics. Where others shout, he calculates. It is a habit that will define his style in later life. The cold analyst masked by the hesitant manner, but the old, frail body that has dogged him since childhood does not care for his bright new ambitions. Illness claws at him. Exhaustion saps his strength. He passes his exams brilliantly. And then, just as the path to an academic career seems to open, his health collapses. The doctors are blunt. If he stays in the damp, pressured air of England, he may not survive. So the young aristocrat does something astonishing. He disappears. In 1853, against every expectation, Robert Cecil boards a ship and sails away from the world that shaped him. Doctors call it seeking a better climate. It feels more like exile and escape. The voyage takes him far beyond the familiar circuits of the British upper class. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Names that, in London clubs, are just colored smudges on maps, suddenly become landscapes of burning light and endless distances. On deck, in the screaming winds of the Southern Ocean, he is no longer Lord Robert, the awkward younger son. He is simply a sick young man trying to stand upright as waves toss the ship like a toy. One storm tears a mast. Water crashes over the rails. For an hour, it is not clear whether they will live to see morning. Robert grips the timber until his fingers ache, stares into the blackness, and confronts a simple, brutal thought. Titles mean nothing. If the sea decides to take you, when they reach land, the shock is different but just as deep. In New South Wales, he sees settlements hacked out of wilderness, raw wooden streets under a vast, silent sky. In the bush, wealthy squatters and rough laborers share the same harsh sun, the same uncertainty. In New Zealand, he meets Maori leaders, proud and wary, negotiating with or resisting British power on their own terms. The empire, from this angle, is not a comfortable abstraction. It is an experiment written in sweat, fear, hope, and occasional blood. Robert writes letters home describing what he sees, letters that are sharp, observant, sometimes brutal in their judgments. They will become, later, a published travel journal. The first sign that his true weapon may not be the sword or even the spoken word, but the pen. Far away, the British Parliament is tearing itself apart over the Crimean War. Lord Aberdeen's government is tottering. A rising Liberal politician named William Gladstone is at the center of the storm, fighting over budgets and principles with a kind of fervor that makes older men nervous. Robert reads the newspapers when he can get them. Sheets weeks or months out of date, stained and crumpled from other hands. Somewhere between strange coastlines and crowded decks, an idea takes shape. Perhaps his place is not permanently out here at the edges of empire. Perhaps it is in the heart of the storm, where men like Gladstone are trying to remake the state that rules all this. A thought follows close behind, like a shadow. If he goes back, it must be soon. Health is uncertain. His allowance is small. The family estates are entailed. He will never be rich in his own right. Time, for all his aristocratic birth, is not on his side. The clock starts to tick louder. When he returns to England, the air of Hatfield feels different. The rooms are the same. The portraits stare from the walls with the same cold gaze. But Robert himself has changed. He has seen an empire in its raw state. He has looked into the face of the ocean and understood how small one life is. His father, the second Marquess, has not changed. He still expects a son to behave as a Cecil should. Dutiful, compliant, choosing a respectable career path. The church, perhaps, or quiet local office, until the time comes to take a seat in the House of Commons and vote as the family expects. But Robert has tasted distance. He has written honestly, sometimes sharply, about what he's seen. He has survived storms and fever. There is a stubborn streak in him now, a willingness to suffer rather than be bent. It is about to be tested. In 1853, opportunity and pressure collide. A pocket borough, Stamford, controlled by the Cecil family, needs a representative. With his older brother destined for the title, Robert is the spare. It is his turn to serve. He is 23 years old when he walks, slightly stooped, into the House of Commons for the first time, his name on the roll as Lord Robert Cecil, Member of Parliament for Stamford. The building is still recovering from the Great Fire of 1834, but the new Gothic chambers are already thick with smoke, rumor, and ambition. Here sit men who control armies, trade routes, lives and futures. The air vibrates with a kind of controlled violence. Somewhere on those benches is William Gladstone, dark, intense, eyes burning with religious conviction and reforming zeal. Robert notices him. Gladstone barely registers the young conservative lordling from Stamford. For now, their paths only cross in the voting lobbies, in the murmur of speeches answered by other speeches. But if you could freeze that moment and draw lines into the future, you would see the path of each man arcing upward, curving inexorably toward collision. Britain cannot belong to both of them. Inside the chamber, Robert is not an instant success. His voice trembles. He leans on the back of the bench, his head tilted to one side, as if listening to someone no one else can hear. The manner is odd, almost comical, but the words are something else. He does not flatter. He does not appeal to emotion. He dissects. On foreign policy, he is cautious, deeply suspicious of what he sees as reckless adventures. On domestic politics, he is a defender of aristocratic influence, but not a blind one. He knows the system is flawed. He just fears what might replace it if change comes too quickly, driven by men whose faith in the people is almost religious. In one of his early interventions, he attacks the handling of the Crimean War with icy precision. The government benches bristle. A few colleagues, equally skeptical of the war, take note. Here is a young man who dares to cut at his own side when he thinks they are wrong. But speaking truth to power has a price, especially when power lives under your own roof. Away from Westminster, another drama is unfolding, more personal and, to Robert's aristocratic world, more shocking than anything in the chamber. He has fallen in love. The woman is Georgina Alderson, the daughter of a judge. She is intelligent, warm, and, by the brutal social arithmetic of the time, not nearly grand enough for a Cecily. To Robert, after years of loneliness, condescension, and cold corridors, she is a revelation. Someone who sees the man behind the title, who believes in him when he barely believes in himself. To his father, the match is almost an insult. The second Marquess lays down the law. This marriage is beneath the family. It must not, cannot happen. If Robert insists, he will pay for it. In money, in position, in favor. Robert hesitates. Defy his father, and he risks being cut off, left to support himself on a backbench salary and whatever he can earn with his pen. Obey. And he betrays the one person who has offered him unconditional warmth. For a young man raised on obedience and fear of disgrace, this is the real test. He chooses Georgina. They marry in 1857. The scandal is quiet but deep. His father slashes his allowance. Relatives shake their heads at the folly of it all. A future Prime Minister of Britain, reduced to counting coins, worrying about rent, writing feverishly for newspapers under pseudonyms, to keep his new household afloat. It is a twist no one in Hatfield's long gallery of portraits would have predicted. The proud young aristocrat, living on his wits. Like a common professional, his pen now not just a weapon of opinion but a means of survival. He begins to write for the Saturday Review, an influential weekly. The tone is fierce, controlled, often merciless. He attacks political cant, fashionable liberalism, what he sees as shallow sentimentality in foreign affairs. The shy boy from Eton discovers a new way to strike back at the world. Not with fists, but with adjectives honed like knives. Unbeknown to him, one of the future readers and occasional targets of these barbed essays will be William Gladstone, the man he will, one day, face across the dispatch box, again and again, as they battle over Ireland, empire, and the very soul of the conservative and liberal visions of Britain. The ink dries. The clock continues to tick. By the end of the 1850s, the young Lord Robert stands at a precarious crossroads. He has a fragile body, a fierce mind, and a marriage that has cost him his father's full support. He has seen the empire's edges and the dark water beyond them. He has stepped inside the House of Commons and felt that peculiar electricity when 100 powerful men fall silent to listen, and then roar their approval or scorn. Outside the Palace of Westminster, pressure for political reform is rising again. Crowds gather, pamphlets fly. Men demand that the franchise, the right to vote, be extended beyond the narrow circle of property owners. For men like Gladstone, this is justice. For men like Robert, still shaped by those brutal nights at Eton and the chaos he has glimpsed abroad. It looks like rushing toward a cliff. He is not yet Lord Salisbury. He is not yet Foreign Secretary, Prime Minister, or master of the world's largest empire from the shadowed comfort of Hatfield's library. He is something less secure and in a way more dangerous. He is a man who knows his class is on probation, who has realized, far earlier than most of his peers, that time is running out for the old order. Either it will adapt, or it will be swept aside by men like Gladstone, men ready to harness the anger and hopes of the masses. The boy who lay awake counting cracks in a school ceiling now lies awake in a modest London house, listening to the city's endless rumble, feeling the weight of a question pressing down on his chest. Can he, the awkward younger son who has always felt out of place, become the strategist his class, and perhaps his country, will need to survive the coming storm? The answer will come in the next act of his life, as the battle over reform, power, and the future of Britain explodes into open war. Imagine a man who once had to beg a newspaper editor for a few extra guineas. Now imagine that same man, 20 years later, sitting at a green baize table in Berlin, while emperor's envoys wait for him to decide whether Europe goes to war. The ink-stained journalist and the master of the map are the same person. Robert Gascoigne Cecil, now edging toward the title history, will remember Lord Salisbury, but he isn't there yet. When the 1860s begin, he is still only Lord Robert, a slightly awkward backbencher with chronic headaches, 2 honest speeches, and a dangerously sharp pen. On the other side of the political battlefield, William Gladstone is rising like a storm front, passionate, evangelical, with a vision of moral progress that thrills the new middle classes and terrifies men like Robert. The distance between them looks immense, and yet the clock is already ticking down to the moment when the fate of the British Empire will hang on which of these two men gets to the palace first. The storm that will lift Robert up and nearly break him has a dry technical name: parliamentary reform. What it really means is this: who gets to rule Britain? By the mid-1860s, the answer can no longer be just men like Roberts. Industrial workers are reading, organizing, marching. Huge demonstrations in Hyde Park pound like distant artillery in the ears of Parliament. Inside the chamber, Gladstone preaches that the working man is fit for the vote, that extending the franchise is not a threat but a moral duty. Robert sits on the conservative benches, watching, calculating. He knows something most of his own side refuse to face: the old world of tiny electorates, pocket boroughs, and gentlemen's agreements cannot survive another generation. But he also believes that to hand political power too quickly to an untested mass is to gamble the whole Constitution on a romantic dream. The conflict is personal. His own seat, Stamford, is one of those small, tightly controlled boroughs that reformers spit on as rotten remnants of aristocratic control. If men like Gladstone have their way, the system that gave Robert his voice will be blown apart. When the Liberal government falls in 1866 and a Conservative administration under Lord Derby takes over, Robert is unexpectedly summoned from the ranks. He is offered high office, Secretary of State for India. The boy who once wandered glumly through Hatfield's galleries now holds, on paper, the lives of hundreds of millions in his hand. From the snows of the Himalayas to the steaming deltas of Bengal, files pile up on his desk bearing the echo of the 1857 Indian Rebellion. Mutinies, reprisals, reform schemes, missionary complaints. He studies, questions, absorbs. And above his head, the issue of reform comes crashing back. Because it is not Gladstone now pushing to extend the vote. It is his own party. This is the twist that shocks almost everyone, including Robert himself. Benjamin Disraeli, dark-eyed, theatrical, a novelist turned politician, seizes on reform as a weapon. If the Conservatives, not the Liberals, are the ones to trust the people, perhaps they can capture the loyalty of the new voters and crush Gladstone's moral crusade at its source. Robert watches Disraeli at the dispatch box, sarcastic, smiling, turning and twisting concessions like a juggler. The Conservative Reform Bill of 1867 expands the electorate far beyond what most Tories ever dreamed of accepting. Disraeli is gambling the party's identity to outflank his enemies. To some of Robert's colleagues, this is genius. To Robert, it feels like treason. His mind goes back to those dormitories at Eton, to the tyranny of the stronger over the weaker. He remembers the raw democracies of the colonial settlements. Rough men shouting, no one quite in control. Mass power, unanchored, frightens him. He tries to fight from within. He writes, He argues in cabinet. He warns that Disraeli is leading them into a leap in the dark, a phrase that will stick to the 1867 Reform Act forever. The hours in conference grow longer, the air thicker. Outside Westminster, crowds cheer the coming bill. Inside, the government is starting to fracture. One evening, with the arguments going in circles and the text of the bill sliding further from anything he can support, Robert makes his choice. He resigns. This is not a grand cinematic defiance. It is a quiet walk out of office, a letter, a bowed head. But for a man who has been trained all his life to endure, to obey, to bend, it is a cataclysmic act. The Conservatives carry the bill without him. The electorate doubles. In some towns, it triples. The old electoral map of Britain is shattered. Inside his study, out of office, Robert sits at a desk buried in papers and asks himself an unforgiving question. If the tide of democracy cannot be stopped, is there another way to shape it? The country answers him brutally at the ballot box. In 1868, with the newly enlarged electorate voting for the first time, the Conservatives lose heavily. Disraeli is swept from office. Gladstone, now at the height of his powers, strides into Downing Street as Prime Minister, the embodiment of the new moral middle-class Britain. Robert is shoved to the margins. That same year, his father dies. Robert inherits the title, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury. Overnight, Lord Robert becomes Lord Salisbury, head of an ancient house, master of Hatfield, shifted from the noisy, smoky Commons to the red leather benches of the House of Lords. To many observers, this looks like the end of his upward climb. The real battles of politics, everyone says, are now in the Commons, among the elected men. The Lords are a dignified afterthought, a place for old lions to sleep. Salisbury does not sleep. He retreats to Hatfield, to that lamplit library he has loved since childhood. But this time, he is not hiding. He is building. By day he reads history, diplomacy, economics, the lives of statesmen long gone. By night he writes article after article for the Saturday Review and other journals, unsigned or pseudonymous, pour out of him. He lashes Gladstone's reforms as reckless sentimentality, ridicules liberal faith in human perfectibility, skewers Disraeli's opportunism. The prose is cool, almost icy. The emotions behind it are not. Money is still tight. His father's resentment of the unsuitable marriage has left its mark on the family finances. Salisbury counts expenses, dismisses servants, prunes the great house's staff. The image of the indolent aristocrat is a joke here. He is working like a clerk just to keep the roof over his children's heads. The clock, meanwhile, is ticking in London. Gladstone throws himself into his mission to pacify Ireland, disestablishes the Protestant church there, and passes sweeping reforms to education and the civil service. Abroad, he preaches a high-minded foreign policy that abhors bloody and expensive wars and seeks to restrain imperial expansion. To many, he looks like the living conscience of the nation. To Salisbury, he looks like a man trying to run a lion empire on the ethics of a chapel sermon. When the Conservatives returned to power in 1874 under the now ennobled Lord Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli's chosen title, Salisbury comes back with them. This time, he swallows his distrust. He accepts office again as Secretary of State for India. The world he governs on paper is even more restless than before. Indian national consciousness is awakening. The scars of 1857 are still tender. Railways, telegraphs, and cheap newspapers are knitting the subcontinent together. Famine, mismanagement, and the cold arithmetic of imperial budgets hang over everything. Salisbury reads the reports with a ruthless eye. He does not waste sentiment on empire as civilizing mission. For him, India is an iron fact, indispensable to Britain's status, impossible to hold without firmness and intelligence. He pushes for more competent administration, improved communications, careful, if limited, reforms. Above all, he insists that policy must be made with clear eyes, not wishful thinking. In cabinet, however, another theater of danger is opening. The Balkans. In 1875 and 1876, rebellion sweeps through Bosnia and Bulgaria against the Ottoman Empire. Reports of atrocities, villages burned, civilians massacred, explode across Europe. Russian armies mobilize in the name of Slavic and Orthodox kinship. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, totters. For Gladstone, now leading the liberal opposition, this is a moral crisis. He publishes his blistering pamphlet, Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East, denouncing the Turks and by implication, any British government that props them up. Crowds shout his name at meetings. He turns foreign policy into a kind of mass crusade. For Salisbury and Beaconsfield, this is something more cold-blooded and terrifying. A strategic crisis. If Russia pushes the Turks out of Europe and takes Constantinople, Britain's route to India, through the Suez Canal and the Eastern's Mediterranean, will be at the mercy of the Tsar. Moral outrage, they believe, cannot be allowed to blind Britain to hard realities. But they also know this. Another war with Russia could destroy everything. In 1878, the crisis reaches its climax. Russia, after a brutal campaign, forces the Treaty of San Stefano on the defeated Turks, carving a huge Russian-dominated Greater Bulgaria out of Ottoman lands, almost touching the Aegean. If that treaty stands, Russian influence will dominate the Balkans. Austria-Hungary is furious. Germany watches, wary. The whole European balance quivers. The great powers call for a Congress in Berlin to rewrite the treaty. Britain must send someone to fight its corner. Beaconsfield chooses Salisbury. The armchair strategist is dropped into the hottest room in Europe. Berlin, in the summer of 1878, is a furnace of diplomacy. In Bismarck's capital, under ornate ceilings and thick cigar smoke, the representatives of Europe's empires circle one another with measured smiles and sharpened knives. Salisbury arrives with a double burden. Officially, Beaconsfield is the head of the British delegation. Salisbury is his foreign secretary, his lieutenant. Unofficially, much of the detailed negotiating will fall on Salisbury's shoulders. He has to know every river, every railway, every ethnic knot in the Balkans. And he has to defend British interests without triggering a war. The time pressure is suffocating. Telegrams from London crackle in each evening. Russian armies are still in the field. The mood in Vienna swings between fury and panic. Any leak, any rumor that Britain is giving too much or demanding too harshly, could send markets crashing and generals scrambling for orders. Bismarck, playing honest broker, watches with cold amusement as the British and Russians glare at each other across the maps. In the small hours with the gaslights hissing, Salisbury bends over those maps, red and blue pencil in hand. He carves. He compromises. He draws lines that will define frontiers for generations. He knows that every stroke risks creating new grievances, new future wars, but he also knows that if he fails to impose some kind of order, the alternative is chaos now. There are moments when the whole thing nearly unravels. The Russian delegation storms, threatens to walk. The Austrians push for more. Even Beaconsfield, usually theatrical and unflappable, grows tense. Salisbury holds the line. At last, a settlement emerges. The Treaty of Berlin. Greater Bulgaria is cut down to size and divided. Austria-Hungary gets the right to occupy Bosnia. Britain takes Cyprus as a strategic outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. No one is fully satisfied. Everyone is just satisfied enough not to fight. When Beaconsfield returns to London proclaiming peace with honor to a roaring crowd at Victoria Station, Salisbury slips back more quietly. But in the chancelleries of Europe, men have taken note. There is a new player on the board, an austere, nearsighted Marquess who prefers logic to grandstanding, and who is not afraid to carve up a continent if it keeps the empire safe. Back home, in his modest, slightly shabby study at Hatfield, he sits again in his armchair, closes his eyes, and feels the strain in his chest. The empire may have bought itself time. He is not sure how much. The next twist comes from the voters. While Salisbury is redrawing the Balkans, the political ground under his own feet is shifting again. The Second Great Reform Act has already changed the electorate. Now, in 1880, as a long, wet, angry winter drags on, Gladstone launches his Midlothian campaign, thundering against imperial bullying and bluster, denouncing Beaconsfield's foreign policy as immoral and wasteful. It is one of the first great modern election campaigns. Mass meetings, railway tours, slogans, the press humming like a gigantic amplifier for a single man's voice. The verdict is devastating. The Conservatives are crushed at the polls. Beaconsfield falls. Gladstone, older now but still burning, returns to Downing Street as if claiming a divine mandate. He believes he has not only the numbers but the moral right to reshape the empire according to his conscience. For Salisbury, who has just proved in Berlin how fragile peace really is, this is a nightmare. Beaconsfield is old, ill, and soon to die. The Conservative Party needs a new leader. Technically, Sir Stafford Northcote leads them in the Commons. In reality, eyes turned to Salisbury, the man who resigned on principle, who held his nerve in Berlin, who can match Gladstone's intellect, without sharing his fervor. The decision is not formally announced. It grows like mold in the corners. By 1881, Salisbury is, in effect, the leader of the Conservative Party. He now has to do something no Cecil has ever done before. Build a modern political machine. From Hatfield and from his house in Arlington Street, he orchestrates a quiet revolution. He encourages the creation of local conservative associations, supports new campaign techniques, and, above all, makes friends in the press. The boy who once found refuge in books now uses newspapers as artillery. Whenever Gladstone stumbles, over Ireland, over Egypt, over the brutal disaster of General Gordon's death at Khartoum in 1885, Salisbury is ready with a cold, cutting indictment that travels across Britain in print by morning. Events move faster, more unpredictably. In Egypt, Britain is sucked into occupation after stepping in to protect the Suez route. In Ireland, agrarian unrest and violent nationalism explode again, pushing Gladstone toward the explosive idea of home rule, self-government. For the island, at Westminster, the government wobbles. In June 1885, after a series of defeats and rebellions among his own MPs, Gladstone's administration falls. The Queen sends for Salisbury, the boy who once clung to a ship's rail in the Southern Ocean, wondering if his title meant anything in the face of the waves, now walks into Buckingham Palace as the choice to lead the empire's government. He is appointed Prime Minister. It is not the triumphant coronation some might imagine. His Conservative Party does not have a majority. He depends on the reluctant tolerance of Irish nationalist MPs and the divisions in liberal ranks. The franchise has just been extended again in 1884-85 to include millions of rural laborers. The next election will be fought under a new, more democratic system. Salisbury knows exactly what this means. He has, at most, a few months to prove that an aristocratic statesman can govern in a mass age, to show that conservatism can adapt, without surrendering, that the empire can be defended without sliding into either Gladstonian moralism or reckless jingoism. Outside Downing Street, the traffic rattles and clatters. Farther away, in the narrow streets of Dublin and the teeming alleys of Calcutta, in the factories of Birmingham and the shipyards of Glasgow, lives that barely know his name will be touched by the decisions he makes under that grey London sky. Inside, the new Prime Minister of Britain stands at the window, mustache bristling slightly, eyes red-rimmed from strain, and thinks of a question that has haunted him since he first entered Parliament as a hesitant young man. In a world where the many now have a voice, can a man of the few still hold the center? Behind him, the clock on the mantelpiece ticks, steady and indifferent. Time, and the next, far more dangerous phase of his life in power, has already begun. He had finally reached the top, and the country gave him just 7 months to prove he deserved it. 7 months. For a man who had spent 20 years clawing his way back from obscurity, that deadline felt like a cosmic joke. Every time the clock in Downing Street chimed the hour, it was really counting down to the first great test of Lord Salisbury's rule. Could an aristocrat built for the age of deference survive the age of democracy? Outside, the new voters, miners, dockers, railwaymen, farm laborers, were reading cheap newspapers by gaslight, arguing politics, in pubs and crowded kitchens. Inside number 10, under the steady yellow glare of oil lamps, Salisbury spread out memoranda and maps, attempting something nobody had quite managed before. To run a 19th-century empire with something like 20th-century efficiency, but the ghost waiting for him in every corridor was not the empire. It was William Gladstone. The immediate problem was Ireland. Gladstone was out of office but far from finished. He was watching Salisbury's fragile minority government like a hawk, sensing opportunity. For decades, Ireland had been the moral and political wound in the side of the United Kingdom. Poverty, land agitation, sectarian hatred, and an increasingly militant demand for home rule, an Irish parliament of its own. Salisbury had no illusions. He thought of Ireland not as a romantic nation, but as a dangerously divided society sitting on Britain's western flank, with the Atlantic at its back and American money slipping into nationalist pockets. Give it too much autonomy, he feared, and one day the Union Jack would be hauled down in Dublin to the cheers of Britain's enemies. Yet his own power depended on Irish votes. His government survived week to week, held up by a shaky understanding with Charles Stewart Parnell's Irish nationalists, men who, wanted precisely the home rule. Salisbury dreaded. He could not repress them without falling, and he would not give them what they wanted. And so, as 1885 turned into 1886, he governed in a kind of suspended animation, holding on for time to build up the conservative machine under the new electoral system, time to let Gladstone make the next, perhaps fatal, move. The move came sooner than he expected. In early 1886, the game board flipped. Rumors began to leak, whispers in club smoking rooms, hints in friendly newspapers, that Gladstone, now pushing 76, had decided on one last colossal throw of the dice. He would return to power with a single, blazing mission: Home Rule for Ireland. The effect was electric. Liberal MPs were stunned. Some were elated, others horrified. Irish nationalists rejoiced. Unionists in Britain's Protestant north, especially in Ulster, felt the ground under their feet shake. Salisbury saw his opening. He could not stop Gladstone from coming back. His own minority position made that impossible. In January 1886, his government fell. The Queen, with visible reluctance, sent for Gladstone. Salisbury walked out of Downing Street knowing he had lost the first round. But he also knew this: now every misstep over Ireland would have Gladstone's name on it. The months that followed were like watching a fault line crack. Gladstone moved with his old urgency, introducing a Home Rule bill that would create an Irish legislature in Dublin. He spoke as if conscience itself were at the dispatch box, about justice, history, and reconciliation. The liberal grassroots, the chapels, the earnest middle classes, thrilled to his moral thunder. But inside Parliament, the reaction was very different. Liberal Unionists, men like Joseph Chamberlain, radical on social questions but fiercely committed to the unity of the kingdom, rebelled. They could not face the idea of an Irish parliament dominated by men they saw as potential rebels, perhaps even traitors, while British soldiers still garrisoned the island. Salisbury and his conservatives watched the Liberal Party tear itself apart and quietly open their arms to the rebels. In the crowded, sweaty lobbies of Westminster, in late-night meetings under gaslight, a new alliance formed. When Gladstone's Home Rule Bill finally came to a vote in June 1886, it was defeated, not just by conservatives, but by a chunk of his own party. Outside the chamber, the air was so hot and packed that MPs staggered into the corridor, gasping. Inside, Gladstone sat rigid, his face a mask, while the numbers were read out. He had staked his career, his reputation, almost his soul, on that bill. Salisbury had staked something colder: his calculation that the British electorate, when faced with the prospect of the United Kingdom breaking apart, would choose order over idealism. Now the question would be answered. The subsequent election was like a duel conducted across an entire nation. Gladstone crisscrossed the country, pleading with voters to support his Irish experiment. Salisbury, dry, precise, and sardonic, painted Home Rule as the first step toward imperial disintegration, a reward for violence, a betrayal of loyalist minorities. When the ballots were counted, the numbers told a brutal story. Gladstone lost. The Liberals split. And for the first time, Salisbury returned to Downing Street not as a caretaker, but as the head of a solid majority, an alliance of conservatives and liberal unionists determined to keep the United Kingdom intact. The clock that had been ticking against him now appeared to be ticking in his favor. He intended to use every second. Power, for Salisbury, did not mean a whirl of speeches and public passion. It meant systems. The man who preferred his library to a platform now set about remaking the machinery of the state. On Ireland, he followed a double track. On the one hand, he backed coercion, stringent crimes acts to curb intimidation and agrarian violence, police powers that made liberals shudder. On the other, he pushed land reform, encouraging tenants to buy out their landlords with government loans. Killing home rule with kindness, some called it. Salisbury never used the phrase, but he understood the strategy. Drain the anger out of Irish politics by making life materially better, while keeping ultimate power in London. At home, he performed an almost paradoxical trick: an aristocrat presiding over more democracy. Under his government, county councils were created in England and Wales in 1888, elected local authorities that took real power out of the hands of magistrates and squires. Elementary education edged closer to being free and universal. Public health measures, urban improvements, and careful steps toward social protection crept into the statute book. He did not love these changes romantically. He accepted them as the price of survival in a mass age. If the conservatives did not help manage democracy, he believed, democracy would eventually sweep them away. All the while, the rivalry with Gladstone simmered. The grand old man refused to fade. He resigned in 1894, came back, resigned again. Each time he went, it seemed final. Each time he returned, he tried to reopen the Irish question. Salisbury answered with a patient, almost icy persistence. If Gladstone was trying to bend history by sheer moral force, Salisbury was trying to exhaust it, to keep the settlement of 1886 intact until the very possibility of Home Rule withered. By the early 1890s, the scales were tilting. In 1892, the Conservatives lost office and Gladstone snatched one last frail Liberal government from the jaws of age and illness. He tried again with Home Rule. The House of Lords, Salisbury's house, killed the bill. Gladstone stalked away from public life at last, muttering darkly about hereditary obstruction. The duel was over. Salisbury had not merely out-argued his rival. He had outlasted him. Yet while the Irish storm slowly abated, another tempest gathered on a far larger map. The late Victorian world was entering the scramble for Africa and a new age of great power rivalry. Railways were lunging into deserts. Telegraph lines were stitching continents together. New battleships bristling with steel and guns were sliding down launch ramps into gray northern seas. Salisbury, in his third and longest spell in office after 1895, found himself holding two of the most dangerous jobs on earth at once, Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. There were days when it seemed he spent more time with maps than with people. From the Foreign Office in Whitehall to Hatfield's study, he tracked French columns inching across West Africa, German schemes in East Africa, Russian probes toward India's frontiers. He spoke dryly of the great game of beggar my neighbor, but he knew there was nothing playful about it. One misjudged frontier, one insulted ambassador, could mean war on a scale Europe had never seen. Time pressure now came in a new form. Not electoral cycles, but the relentless advance of rival powers. In the 1890s, the British Empire was still vast, the famous globe shaded almost a quarter in red. But beneath the pink flourishes on schoolroom maps lay cracks. Under-defended frontiers, sullen subject peoples, overstretched finances. Germany was industrializing at terrifying speed. The United States and Japan were rising. France, though wounded by 1870, was desperate. To rebuild its glory overseas, Salisbury's response was not a grand imperial hymn. It was a grim, almost pessimistic realism. "We are living," he once remarked, "in a period when the great nations of the world are being brought more and more into contact, and collision is almost inevitable." The best a British statesman could do, he believed, was to delay catastrophe, to choose the right enemies, or postpone confrontation, until Britain was better prepared. He worked like a man trying to juggle lit shells. In Africa, he cut deals with the French and Germans, trading stretches of jungle and savanna no cabinet minister would ever see, to prevent their empires from slamming too hard against Britain's. In China, he tried to balance new concessions with a policy of the open door, fearing that if any one power swallowed too much, the map of Asia would be redrawn in a way Britain could not control. And yet, even his careful maneuvers could not keep every spark from catching. In 1898, on a dusty, baking stretch of the Nile at a place called Fashoda, British and French forces met, flags flying, rifles loaded, on both claiming the same remote patch of swamp and river for their empires. For a few weeks, the two nations teetered on the edge of war, over a place almost no one at home could find on a map. In London, newspapers screamed, "In Paris," crowds chanted for honor. Rugby-playing schoolboys in England marked out Fashoda on their playing fields and charged at one another. Salisbury, hunched over telegrams, appealed to something deeper than pride. Exhaustion. France, he judged, was in no state to fight a naval war with Britain. Behind the scenes, he gave them a way out that preserved their dignity without giving up Britain's strategic command of the Nile. Slowly, the crisis cooled. The French pulled back. It was a victory without parades, exactly the kind he preferred. But the next crisis would not be containable in the same way. At the far end of Africa, in the high, sun-blasted veld of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, a very different kind of enemy was waiting. Not another European great power, but small, fiercely independent Boer republics sitting on top of some of the richest gold deposits on Earth. British capital had poured into the Rand goldfields. British migrants, Uitlanders, had swelled the town of Johannesburg from a tent camp into a raw, non-Boer city. Tensions with the Boer governments flared over rights, representation, and control of the mines. In Salisbury's cabinet, one voice pushed relentlessly for a harder line. Joseph Chamberlain, now colonial secretary, the same formers, radical, who had once broken with Gladstone over Ireland and joined the Unionist cause. Brilliant, restless, with a monocle and an almost missionary zeal for imperial expansion, Chamberlain represented a new, aggressive energy on the conservative side. To Salisbury, he was both an asset and a threat. They needed each other to hold their coalition together. But Chamberlain's impatience with what he saw as Salisbury's caution, his hunger for a bold, muscular imperial policy, created a second rivalry, this time inside the government itself. When negotiations with the Boers collapsed in 1899, the press, and Chamberlain all pushed toward confrontation. Salisbury knew what war in South Africa would mean. Not a neat naval victory or a quick punitive campaign, but a grinding conflict, 6,000 miles away, draining men and money, inflaming opinion across the world. Yet he also understood that if Britain seemed unable or unwilling to defend its subjects and its strategic interests, the entire facade of imperial power would crack. War came. The opening months were a humiliation. Boer commandos on wiry ponies outshot and outmaneuvered British troops in their red and khaki. Towns with names few Englishmen had ever heard of, Ladysmith, Mafeking, Kimberley, were besieged. The Telegraph poured bad news into London like a steady drip of poison. Crowds that had cheered the war at first now turned nervous, then angry. The opposition smelled blood. Foreign papers rejoiced at British setbacks. Anti-war meetings filled halls with smoke and fury. Reports of scorched earth tactics and concentration camps where Boer civilians suffered and died shocked nonconformist opinion. Inside number 10, the man at the center of this storm sat almost motionless, fingers steepled, mustache twitching as he listened to reports. He had always believed that the empire rested on perception as much as force. Now the perception was of a slow, lumbering giant, vulnerable and callous. And time was not on his side. He was nearly 70. His eyesight was worse. His headaches were more frequent. He worked late into the night, shuttling between Hatfield and Whitehall. His bulky figure lowered gingerly in and out of train compartments, as if the very act of travel were draining away what strength he had left. But he did not flinch from the war he had chosen to wage. Slowly, grindingly, British numbers and industrial might asserted themselves. Reinforcements poured in from across the empire. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians. A reminder that this was not just Britain's fight, but the empire's. The sieges were lifted. Boer capitals fell. What followed was an ugly, protracted guerrilla struggle. Commandos melting into the veld, farmhouses burned, women and children herded, into camps whose very name would, in the next century, become synonymous with horror. Salisbury did not design that system, but it happened under his watch, and its stain clung to his government. By 1902, peace was finally hammered out at Vereeniging. The Boers accepted British sovereignty in return for generous terms and a promise of eventual self-government. Salisbury had won. Yet the victory tasted of ash. The war had cost over 20,000 British lives and far more Boer civilians. It had tarnished Britain's reputation. It had exposed the weakness of recruiting an underfed, unhealthy urban population for modern war. When Salisbury read the statistics of rejected volunteers, men turned away because their bodies were wrecked by slum life, he could not help but see another kind of clock running down. The time left before Britain's great power status was challenged not just abroad, but by its own failures at home. In his final years in office, his foreign policy turned toward something new. The slow, cautious weaving of alliances. For most of the 19th century, Britain had prided itself on splendid isolation, staying aloof from permanent continental commitments. Salisbury shared that instinctive detachment, but he also saw the world hardening into rival blocs, and he knew isolation could become exposure. In 1902, the same year the Boer War ended, Britain signed an alliance with Japan, a startling departure linking a European empire with an Asian power as equals in naval strategy. It was the first crack in the old order, the first hint of the entanglements that would, a dozen years later, pull Britain into catastrophe. Salisbury would not live to see that war, but he sensed the direction of travel. Once he had been the young man railing against change in an overcrowded school dormitory. Then the middle-aged outsider at Hatfield, writing scathing articles while Gladstone bestrode the stage. Now he was the establishment itself, watching the world shift under his feet, aware that his own reflexes were honed for a game that would soon be played with different pieces. The competitor who now loomed largest was not Gladstone, long since gone to his grave in Hawarden, but time. His cabinet colleagues could see it in the way he sometimes sat, eyes half closed, as debates swirled around him. In the long pauses, before he answered. In the weight of the files on his desk, his nephew Arthur Balfour, clever and charming, increasingly took on more day-to-day business. Chamberlain, restless as ever, eyed the future with reforming schemes that made some conservatives shudder. Salisbury knew he had to choose his own exit, or have it chosen for him. In July 1902, just weeks after the Treaty of Vereeniging ended the South African War, he traveled to Buckingham Palace one more time. The empire was celebrating the coronation of a new king, Edward VII. Crowds thronged the streets, flags rattled in the wind, bands played tunes that drowned, for an afternoon, the memory of casualty lists and scandals. Inside the palace, in a quieter room, an old man placed his resignation in the monarch's hands. He recommended Balfour as his successor. The nephew he had once watched stumbling along Hatfield's terraces, oblivious to politics, would now inherit the premiership. Salisbury left office as he had lived much of his life, without theatrics. No grand farewell speech, no self-congratulation, just a slow withdrawal to the house that had formed him, to the library whose shelves he knew like other men knew their own faces. Behind him he left an empire seemingly at its apogee, bigger, more tightly wired together, more proudly conscious of itself than ever before. He also left behind a world in which the very forces he had spent his life trying to manage, nationalism, democracy, industrial power, imperial rivalry, were converging into something darker and more uncontrollable than even his pessimism had imagined. At Hatfield, in the deepening Edwardian twilight, Lord Salisbury settled into the role of elder statesman. His critics called him a relic. His admirers called him the last of the great Victorians. In his own mind, the question was simpler and harsher. Had he merely delayed the inevitable? Or had he, in the delicate unseen calculations of decades in power, bought his country the only kind of victory still available in a dangerous world? The answer would not come until long after the pen had fallen from his hand, and the House of Cecil had lit its lamps for him one final time. Because the world did answer his question. It just waited until he was gone, then shouted it back at him in artillery blasts, collapsing empires, and the sound of young men gasping for breath in muddy trenches. But in the summer of 1902, Lord Salisbury didn't hear any of that. What he heard was something far more intimate and far more frightening: silence. For the first time in nearly 20 years, no red dispatch box thudded onto his desk at Hatfield each morning. No train carriage was reserved for the Prime Minister. No messenger stood waiting by the door, hat in hand, ready to dash to Downing Street with his corrections and commands. Power had left the building, and he was still alive inside it. Retirement came to him not as a gentle glide, but as a sudden stop. One day he was deciding on war and peace. The next, he was being reminded, very politely, that the Foreign Office no longer reported to him. His nephew Arthur Balfour now chaired the cabinet. Joseph Chamberlain now blazed across the newspapers as the government's most exciting, controversial figure. New voices, new ideas, new fights. And an old man looking at them from a velvet armchair, his feet wrapped in a rug, feeling the clock inside his chest ticking faster than ever. Doctors had started to circle him years before he retired. They muttered about his heart, his lungs, his weight. They warned him about the strain of late hours and endless travel. He ignored them with the same sardonic patience he used on over-earnest politicians. But now there was no excuse. Now their warning sounded like a sentence. He began to ration his energy the way, in office, he had rationed diplomatic risks. Mornings were for letters, for walking slowly through Hatfield's gardens with a stick, for supervising small repairs to the house. Afternoons he often vanished to the library, that long paneled room which had sustained him through every phase of his life. Exile, comeback, supremacy. Now it became something else, a refuge from the future. On the desk lay piles of papers, not dispatches from ambassadors or minutes from cabinet. Those belonged to the state, not to him, but drafts of essays, private, correspondence, old notebooks filled with his spidery handwriting from the 1860s and 70s. He sorted them with an odd urgency, burning some, annotating others, setting aside bundles to be preserved. There was the time limit. He could feel it in the way the stairs at Hatfield now left him breathless, in the stabbing headaches that forced him to sit in the dark, curtains drawn until the pain ebbed, in the way a few hours of visitors could wipe him out for a day. No monarch gave him a deadline now. His own body did. So he worked against it, quietly, methodically, as he always had. Politicians still came. They stepped out of motor cars or carriages onto Hatfield's gravel with the peculiar mixture of deference and calculation that he had seen all his life. Though he no longer held office, they knew that his words still carried weight in the shires, in the Carlton Club, in the deeper currents of conservative opinion. Balfour came, elegant and slightly distracted, to talk policy and family gossip in the same breath. He had inherited the premiership, but not his uncle's pessimism. Where Salisbury saw cliffs, Balfour often saw fog. Dangerous, yes, but perhaps passable with enough cleverness. Chamberlain came too, monocle flashing, voice brisk, bringing with him the storm front of a new dispute, tariff reform. He wanted to remake Britain's trade policy, to throw away the sacred Victorian doctrine of free trade and impose duties on imports, especially from foreign rivals, while giving preference to food and goods produced inside the empire. He sold it as a grand imperial bargain. Bind the empire together with markets and money, or watch it drift apart. It was a direct challenge to the economic orthodoxy Salisbury had lived under for half a century. It threatened to split the party he had spent his career unifying. It promised to turn the calm, calculating conservatism of the late Victorian era into a roaring populist crusade. Chamberlain pressed his case with the energy of a man racing a fuse to the powder charge. Britain, he argued, had only a narrow window, a few years, perhaps a decade, before German and American competition turned the workshop of the world into a second-rate power. Act now or accept decline. Time pressure versus time pressure. The old man, whose whole life had been one long argument with history, found himself staging one more, miniature version of that argument, across a small table, lit by a shaded lamp. Chamberlain pleaded for boldness, for a leap in the dark. Salisbury, wheezing slightly, answered with the wary, almost fatalistic realism that had guided him from Egypt to Fashoda to South Africa. Your clock runs fast, he told the colonial secretary, because you imagine that you can move the hands by striking the dial. He doubted that tariffs could save Britain from the underlying forces changing the world. Demographics, industrialization, nationalism. He feared that a great trade quarrel would push Germany and America faster into opposition and saddle British consumers with dearer food. Yet he also sensed something more personal in Chamberlain's urgency, something he knew all too well, the hunger to leave a mark before time ran out. They were both racing death, one with grand new schemes, one with bundles of old papers. When Chamberlain left, the house seemed very quiet. Salisbury sat alone for a long time, the image of that restless, monocled face still bright in his mind. He had spent 20 years fending off Gladstone. Now another rival, younger, brasher, from within his own camp, wanted to drag the Conservative Party into a future Salisbury doubted he would live to see. He would not be around to referee that fight. He could only hope the party, and the country, survived it. That winter, the air at Hatfield felt colder. Servants noticed him shiver more often. His walks grew shorter. Sometimes he had to stop halfway down a corridor, leaning on a table to catch his breath. The newspapers, which had once studied every nuance of his speeches, now carried only the occasional remark, usually recorded by some visitor who had left the great house with a sense that they had, perhaps, just heard from him for the last time. In late 1902 and early 1903, illness pinned him down. He had suffered from what doctors called gout, neuralgia, weakness of the heart for years. Victorian labels covering a range of real, serious problems. Now they converged. Congestion settled on his lungs. Fluid made every breath an effort. One of his daughters sat by his bed, reading quietly as he dozed and woke. Sometimes he asked about politics in that dry, detached way that had once made cabinet colleagues shiver. Has Arthur offended everyone? This week, or only half of them? Is Chamberlain still converting the nation to his gospel? Are the Irish quiet or only waiting? Other times he said nothing at all, staring at the pattern of the curtains, lost somewhere far from the world of telegrams and treaties. Perhaps in those hours, he walked again through the smoking room at Oxford, the air thick with pipe fumes, or through the bitter, humiliating corridors of the 1870s, when Lord Beaconsfield and then Gladstone had towered above him. Perhaps he replayed, not the triumphs, but the narrow escapes. The almost war with Russia over Afghanistan. The almost war with France over Fashoda. The almost collapse of his own party over Ireland. So many crises. So much that could have gone catastrophically wrong with one misjudged cable or one badly timed election. He had survived them. Britain had survived them. Yet the doubts that had haunted him as he left office now crept closer. Had survival been enough? In August 1903, his lungs finally began to fail in earnest. On hot days, the room had to be kept nearly dark. Bright light seemed to cause him pain. Visitors came less often. Even Balfour, weighed down with the premiership, could not easily escape to Hatfield. Messages traveled instead. Polite, affectionate, increasingly anxious. The man who had once controlled fleets and regiments could now barely control his own breathing. On the evening of 22nd August, the house was quiet in that particular way old houses have when everyone inside knows what is happening, or when nobody quite dares to say it out loud. Salisbury lay propped up against pillows. The once massive frame shrunk. The great beard whiter and more disordered than any photographer had ever shown it. His eyes, always his most expressive feature, had dimmed. But not, the servant said later, lost their curious mix of sadness and irony. Sometime after midnight, with his family close by and the rain whispering against the windows, the third Marquess of Salisbury stopped breathing. He had been, at the time of his death, Prime Minister of Britain for longer in total than anyone since the Duke of Liverpool. The last head of an aristocratic dynasty to run the country as both family firm and national machine. The man who had outfought, out-argued, and outlasted William Ewart Gladstone. He died, as he had always wanted to live, at Hatfield, in his own bed, with the noise of the outside world held at bay by thick walls and heavy curtains. The clock in the great hall chimed the quarter hour, then the half, then the hour. For the first time in 73 years, it was not ticking against him. The news rolled out across the country with the next morning's papers. Death of Lord Salisbury, the headlines announced, some in heavy black type, some in more restrained fonts that suited their editors. Discomfort with his politics, editorials poured in, many of them tinged with something that would have amused him. Nostalgia. They praised his caution, his sense of proportion, his refusal to be swayed by fads. They contrasted his calm with the more excitable style then visible in Berlin and Paris. They called him the last great statesman of the Victorian age, even though Victoria herself had been dead for 2 years. In London, astonished tourists watched as the great doors of Westminster Abbey opened once more to receive another titan of 19th-century politics. Gladstone lay there already, entombed in 1898 beneath a slab of stone that bore the words, "He being dead yet speaketh." Now Salisbury followed, carried under high arches along an aisle lined with famous names and forgotten ones. The two great rivals who had spent 30 years fighting over Ireland, over the franchise, over empire and morality and the meaning of Britain itself, now lay within a short walk of each other in the thick, cool darkness of the Abbey. Crowds filed past. Some crossed themselves. Others just stared. If you listened hard enough, you might almost have heard the argument continuing under the stone. Had Gladstone been right, that the empire must bend toward moral justice, even at the cost of risk and division? Or had Salisbury been right, that the first duty of a statesman was to preserve order in a world where history itself seemed stacked against stability? It was a debate too big to settle with a funeral. History would take its time. And then, very suddenly, it would stop taking its time at all. 11 years after Salisbury's death, a car turned the wrong way in a Sarajevo street. A student fumbled with a bomb, and the great powers slid inexorably into the kind of war he had always feared. Industrial, pitiless, and total. The empire he had spent his life trying to shore up hurled millions into the fray. Within the first hour of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, more British soldiers were killed or wounded than in some entire campaigns of Salisbury's era. Men from the mining villages he had hesitantly enfranchised in the 1880s, from the Irish towns he had tried to pacify with land acts and coercion, from the colonial settlements he had tied to London with treaties and war, died yards from where they had gone over the top, cut down by weapons he had never seen. The old strategic balances he had juggled shattered. Britain emerged victorious in 1918, but financially drained, socially shaken, its faith in its own permanence eroded. Within a generation of his death, almost everything Salisbury had spent his career defending began to crumble. The House of Lords, whose hereditary benches he had used to block Home Rule in the 1890s, was cut down by the Parliament Act of 1911. No longer could it simply kill a major reform indefinitely. Gladstone's ghost had taken its revenge. Ireland, whose union with Britain he had treated as a moral and strategic necessity, erupted first in rebellion, then in civil war. By 1922, the green, white, and orange tricolour flew over Dublin Castle, and the Irish Free State walked out of the United Kingdom altogether. The union he had fought to keep intact broke apart barely 20 years after his coffin slid into the Abbey floor. Democracy, which he had tried to manage and contain, swelled beyond anything he had imagined. By 1918, most working-class men had the vote. Within 10 years, most women did too. The mass electorate he had feared as a potential mob became the permanent sovereign of British politics, and the Conservative Party he had painstakingly reshaped into a disciplined machine for a deferential empire found itself campaigning. In a world of mass parties, radio broadcasts, labor rallies, and unemployment marches, measured against that tidal wave, Salisbury's life could look like a rearguard action, skillful, often brilliant, but ultimately doomed. He had delayed Home Rule. He had delayed the democratization of the Lords. He had delayed a general European catastrophe. But delay, a critic might say, is all he had bought. The inevitable, Ireland's partial independence, full mass democracy, the decline of Britain's relative power, arrived anyway, just a little later, and with perhaps even more violence because it had been postponed. Yet that is one reading. There is another. Imagine Britain without Salisbury, a Britain where Gladstone's Home Rule had passed in the 1880s, without land reforms to drain some of the bitterness from Irish politics, a Britain which had rushed into war with Russia in the 1870s, or France in the 1890s, over some glowing patch of map in Central Asia or on the Nile, a Britain which had not, under his cautious diplomacy, bought enough time to adjust its navy, its alliances, its finances to the new century. In that Britain, the catastrophe of 1914 might have come earlier, when the empire was less prepared, when the dominions were less attached, when German industry and population still enjoyed an even deeper relative advantage. In that Britain, an early botched experiment with Home Rule might have produced not a free state decades later, but a violent sundered Ireland in the 1890s, with the United States perhaps backing Dublin against London at a time when transatlantic ties were far more fragile. In that Britain, conservatism might have died as a purely aristocratic creed, refusing to adapt to mass politics, leaving the field entirely to liberals and then to socialists. Salisbury's genius, if it can be called that, lay not in creating shining new worlds, but in managing the existing ones so finely that he squeezed decades of extra life out of arrangements that looked, in hindsight, doomed. He refused to be a visionary. He preferred to be, in his own self-mocking phrase, an old weather-beaten signpost, pointing out dangers, calculating distances, warning travelers that the bridge ahead might not bear a heavy load. Signposts do not get statues in Parliament Square. They do, however, save lives while they stand. For all his aristocratic hauteur, for all his acid comments about the vulgar crowd, Salisbury helped normalize something that would have seemed extraordinary to his grandfather: the peaceful management of a mass democracy by a conservative party. He professionalized party organization, harnessed the cheap press, and built an alliance with the newly enfranchised middle and lower middle classes, shopkeepers, clerks, artisans, who came to see the Conservatives as defenders not just of dukes, but of their savings, their neighborhoods, their idea of order. He accepted local government reform, education acts, modest public health measures, not with Gladstone's moral fervor, but with a wary acceptance that refusing everything meant losing everything. In doing so, he sketched the outline of a kind of conservative modernity that would, long after he was gone, allow his party to compete. In an age of full democracy, radio, and then television, his foreign policy, for all its compromises and stains, left behind a set of hard realities that mattered in the crisis of 1914. A navy second to none, a loose understanding with France over colonial questions, an alliance with Japan that helped check Russia in the Far East, and a wary, suspicious eye on Germany. He did not want a continental war, but when it came, Britain was in a better position to fight it because of choices he had made decades earlier, behind the heavy curtains of Whitehall and Hatfield. That is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. A man who distrusted democracy helped it survive. A man who doubted imperial crusades helped hold the empire together long enough for its slow, negotiated transformation into a commonwealth. Rather than a chaotic collapse, a man who feared the future bought his country time to face it. Today, if you walk through Hatfield House, past the portraits and armor, you may find yourself in a long, quiet room paneled in dark wood, the library. The site is almost shockingly intimate after so many big public images of Victorian power. No throne, no mace, no ceremonial sword. Just shelves, paper, dust motes drifting in a shaft of light. Here, in this room, a young, angry aristocrat once wrote venomous articles about a world he thought was going mad. Here, a middle-aged exile plotted his return to high office. Here, a prime minister, overloaded with maps and memos, tried to calculate how to keep an empire intact without letting it pull his country into ruin. Here, at the end, an old man sorted his papers while his lungs failed. Outside, the world has changed beyond anything he could have imagined. The empire he knew is gone. The House of Lords he relied on is a shadow of its former self. The mass electorate he feared is a fact of everyday politics. The very word conservative now carries meanings, social, cultural, global, that would bewilder him. And yet, if you listen carefully in that room, you can still hear the faint echo of the question he asked himself as he left office. Had he merely delayed the inevitable? Or had he brought Britain the only kind of victory still possible in a dangerous, accelerating world? History never gave him a clear verdict. Perhaps it never will. But the fact that we still ask the question, that we still argue over whether caution can be as heroic as courage, over whether buying time can be as valuable as seizing it, that alone is a kind of tribute. Lord Salisbury did not leave behind a shining doctrine, a grand moral crusade, or a simple slogan. He left behind something less glamorous and far harder to achieve. He left behind decades in which his country, balanced on the edge of forces it barely understood, did not fall.